No matter where you go, gas prices are high. GasBuddy says there's a reason why, and those prices are going to stick around a little longer. Patrick Tahan, head of analysis at GasBuddy, says during the pandemic, people stayed home. The demand for gas plummeted, so oil production plummeted too. As pandemic restrictions have eased, oil production has not increased very much at all. The low supply, high demand, of course, pushed prices right up.
We're looking at a barrel of oil now at about $75 a barrel. That's amongst the highest we've seen since July. And as a result, gas prices in Michigan and the Midwest jumped last week on oil's rebound.
Dahan says these high gas prices could stay longer than expected.
Tightness in the labor market, and that's feeding into this as well. A truck driver shortage that's ongoing. You may have heard about that. That was a concern for this summer, whether or not there'd be enough tanker truck drivers to bring gasoline.
CEO of Mass Transportation Authority Ed Benning says his organization, which serves Genesee County, is less reliant on oil because his fleet utilizes alternative fuel sources, including hydrogen, propane, and compressed natural gas.
If you go back to 2007 and 8, when we had huge spikes in gasoline and diesel fuel, we as an organization made a decision to move away from diesel fuel.
I spoke with people who live in Genesee County about the prices they're seeing at the pump.
It really don't make sense. It's like, why? You know, we always ask, like, why is they steady going up? You go to this gas station, it's one price. The next gas station is even higher.
GasBuddy predicts these high prices will continue throughout the pandemic as the world continues to open back up.
It really all has to do with supply and demand. Last year, there was tons of supply and no demand. This year, there's tons of demand and less supply.
Like a credit limit, but the difference is the credit card company sets your credit limit, where the government is setting its own credit limit. So there's the debt ceiling says the government can't borrow past a certain amount, meaning the national debt can't exceed a certain limit. Well, the problem is Congress passed a budget which called for an additional $3 trillion worth of borrowing that will be tacked onto the national debt. So on the one hand, you have Congress saying, here's this budget that we could only finance through borrowing. While on the other hand, Congress says, well, here's this limit, which makes it illegal for us to borrow what we need in order to spend for the budget we passed. So it's like this real conflict. It's hard to, you can't justify it because Congress is saying, well, we're not letting the Treasury Department borrow to spend what we're telling the Treasury Department to spend.
Was this last year's budget or with the most recent budget that they passed? This was...
Well, it's like just accumulating spending. So it could be from last year's spending if you just project out spending based on what's already been appropriated by Congress. We're going to hit that debt limit by mid-October. So the Treasury Department says, well, hey, unless you raise the debt limit to allow us to borrow, what you're telling us we have to borrow to meet spending obligations, well, then we can't meet these spending obligations, hence we run out of cash.
And then hearing your definition, the average person would say, that's idiotic. I couldn't.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
I couldn't balance myself financially. I couldn't survive in that world. I would not be able to live in that world, but the federal government can.
No, it's a terrible way to run finances for the federal government. Either you have a debt limit and you run balanced budgets, and the debt limit is binding in the sense that it prevents the debt from rising, which it never has. Or you do all this deficit spending, which has been the case basically since the end of World War II, and you have no debt limit. It makes no sense to have a debt limit while at the same time Congress is passing budgets, which will result in the debt limit being hit because of the borrowing that has to happen to meet those spending obligations.
It's never happened, I believe I heard them say in the history of our country that they've raised the debt limit. If it doesn't happen, I'm assuming this is not a good thing for anyone.
Well, this is what happens when there's a government shutdown. So there's been government shutdowns in the past. So there was one when Trump was president, like in 2017 or so.
Yeah.
Then there was one like around 2013. There's one in the 1990s. A lot of times the government shutdown is political posturing. You know, one side trying to blame the other for why the government shut down. It's what everyone hates about politics. And then the posturing ends and really no one wins from the government shutdown, but people don't seem to learn that Government shutdowns are not a way to win political support. So when the government runs out of cash, it has no choice but to shut down because it has no cash to meet expenditures. And then if the government runs out of cash to make interest payments on the outstanding national debt, well, then the debt is technically in a state of default. And that's what people talk about the government never having done before, being in default of the money it owes. The problem is if the government starts defaulting on debt, well, then people start to question the government's ability to repay what it's borrowed. And all of a sudden, the government can't borrow at low interest rates any longer, which is a real problem given how much borrowing the government's doing year to year if the kind of deficit's being run.
What impact then? Obviously, that'd be the worst case, but that would not be a positive for our economy as a whole.
No, because the national debt is so massive right now. It's over 100% of GDP. The yearly deficits, which add to the national debt, we're talking $3 trillion in new debt every single year. At these real low interest rates, we're talking about yearly interest payments being on the order of the defense budget, maybe a little bit less. But you start raising interest rates, maybe because people are worried about a default, maybe interest rates just start rising across the board. All of a sudden, just interest payments on all the debt that's outstanding starts chewing up trillions of dollars of annual spending. And that's spending the government can't get away from, because if you stop making interest payments on the debt, well, now you're in a state of default, which results in a big financial crisis.
It sounds like this is what they talk about with economic reform. If you were, I would say, if you were president, if you were in charge, the whole system sounds like then it needs to be changed. Because there are some cities, school districts, I know, like certain states, when I worked down south, they had to have a balanced budget. It was part of the law. Like certain local governments have to have a balanced budget. But the U.S. government, it sounds like something needs to change.
I think the world would be a more stable place if the federal government was running a balanced budget. If you look at why countries get themselves into trouble, like Greece, like Argentina, like a whole host of countries, it's because the government has borrowed and exceeded its borrowing limits, in the sense that it's borrowed past the point where people start to question the government's ability to repay what is borrowed, and then they stop loaning the government money, which causes the government to face a real shortfall. So the more and more the government borrows, the more and more you're likely to run into the risk where something like that happens. So a balanced budget prevents that from happening. Well, the problem is a balanced budget really requires some real choices by the part of politicians. What are taxes going to be? What are the spending priorities? Whereas deficit spending, well, everything feels like it's free. Spend as much as you want, keep taxes whatever you want, borrow to cover the difference, and we'll worry about the difference in the future.
But you and me and, we can't run our household like that, or I'll end up homeless.
Right, but it feels real great when you're just spending your credit card and not worrying about it, right? Because everything feels like it's free, and that's what the government's been doing for a lot of years. And the question is when does it catch up to you? And no one really has a good answer for that. It's kind of like you don't know until it hits, and then by that time it's too late.
And when with me and with all of us, though, we have that credit card limit. We know when it's going to hit.
Right, but the government can always raise that limit. And so long as interest rates stay low, it faces no immediate limit. It's just that at some point, the government's borrowed so much that people are like, well, we can't expect the government to be able to realistically repay what's borrowed, and then the spigot of loans to the government just shuts off.
Last question. Is this where is this inflation comes in? If you keep allowing that to go higher and higher and higher? Or no?
Then that won't cause inflation by itself.
Yeah.
The question is who's buying the debt that's being issued? So if the Federal Reserve is buying the debt by printing money, well, then that just means the government's paying for its expenditures by printing money, which results in inflation. So that's where inflation can come from, is if the government just starts printing money to pay for its expenditures, which lots of countries have done. Well, now inflation is a problem.
So I take it that's why many argue now, some argue it's a bad time for that $3.5 trillion infrastructure they're talking about. It doesn't coincide very well with what we're talking about right now, I guess.
Yeah, that makes a lot of people nervous, myself included. And if the national debt was really low, well, maybe we could afford to tack on $3.5 trillion for it if the spending justified it. But here we are, debt to GDP exceeds 100%. That hasn't happened since World War II. can the government really afford to tack another 3.5 trillion on top of what's already been borrowed? That's why the White House is saying, well, this $3.5 trillion won't be contributing to the national debt. It'll all be paid for by tax reform, etc. I find that very hard to believe. The question is how much of that $3.5 trillion will be tacked on to the national debt, because the national debt is so high right now.
So where do you see it? You've been looking over years and years. Are they just going to come to an agreement and just keep tacking on that debt? And that's what's happened in the past, I guess. That's
what'll happen. There'll be some political posturing. Maybe the government stays shut down for a week, maybe a day, maybe a month. I think the last one was about a month. But at some point, a deal will be struck to raise the debt limit. It'll be raised for like another 2 years or so worth of borrowing. And then we will lather, rinse, repeat, and do this whole cycle all over again with the limits hit again. It's a terrible way to run the finances of a major country like the US.
And dangerous, because, right, you could run risk of, like other countries, you'd have major problems.
Yeah, you always run the risk of investors getting sick of this constant political dance and not loading the government money any longer, and the government faces a real challenge when private sector purchases of treasury debt dries up.